over the Welcome to Science Sunday. Happy October to everyone, and kind of a rainy morning, but it's getting a few sun beams peeping through the clouds now and looks like a pretty day. We met last a couple weeks ago, and today we meet again, Science Sunday, the second Science Sunday. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. I'm here with Scott Thompson, my good friend and fellow science advocate and
trusty sidekick.
Trusty sidekick, yeah, you're Tonto this week, right? Yep. So the next Science Sunday, Scott has some interesting journeys planned, and he's not going to be here in 2 weeks, but we're going to do it in 3 weeks. So that's not on the 17th, but on the 24th we'll be here. So put your schedules and your calendars and everything all set to see us in 3 weeks from today, and that's the 24th. At around that time, my daughter is planning on giving birth and out in Seattle, so I'm keeping things open, and actually I'm planning on flying out somewhere around the 31st of October out to Seattle, and Scott's going to handle the first Science Sunday of November. We just arm wrestled and I won. Yeah. So Scott's going to be handling the first one in November, and I'll be handling the second Science Sunday in November. So we'll have your science appetite taken care of at just different timings somewhat and different organization than usual. So anyways, that's about it with what's going on with upcoming events or coming up events. But so I wanted to talk today, and this kind of jumps off of my last Science Sunday talk about relics, and it got us talking in the group here about megafauna, and which got us thinking about the population of North America by natives and by the species that were living here, animal species and plant species, all of which could be considered relics of this past if some of them are still around, and many of them are extinct. So we wanted to talk a bit about that. I got excited and started learning more and reading more and discussing more about the land up in Alaska area, and the whole concept of the land bridge, and Beringia is what the scientific concept of it's called now. It's interesting because I think many of us, and I specifically was, kind of laboring along a long ago theory, philosophy, which there's been a lot of data coming out since then that tends to either expand on it or change it slightly and make some things different than what they were. We'll talk about the older theory that was around in the 50s, and I think I was exposed to numerous times and was kind of taken as the explanation, and what's maybe missing from that concept and what new things have come up that are pretty phenomenal explorations. And you can imagine since the 1950s there's been a lot of work in this area. We'll talk about the fields that have gotten a lot more study and time, and we'll see some of the things that they found out. Basically, Beringia is the large landmass that connects Asia, or connected Asia and Canada, and it was caused by sea level drops due to the preponderance and the predominance of glaciers from about 120,000 years ago till about 16,000 years ago. A lot of times I'll be saying before present, so if I say 14,000 years before present, that's obviously about 12,000 BC, since we're 2,000 years after the modern era has started, right? There's differences so significant from what maybe the prevalent notion is that I thought it's worth talking about a bit. On your screen, you can see a picture of Beringia, or a representation, and that's really something that's called Mammoth Steps. When you think of Mammoth Steps, you think you don't want one to step on you, a mammoth to step on. But Mammoth Steps, the steps are kind of the Russian term for the hillsides and rolling hills of the steppe land of Russia.
Without forest, right?
Right, right. Where the predominant feature are grasses and actually herbs. And herbs in this time of the megafauna were actually more prevalent than grasses. You would see amazing amounts of herbs, and it became actually the major food source for a lot of these megafauna, the herb-eating megafauna that were around, and not as much in the grasses, although these grasses that are there in steppes, some of them are still around in very small, isolated realms in China, Mongolia, some places like that, Russia. They still have some of the very nutritious, productive, highly productive grasses and herbs that were still there at that time. And this has been one development of the study of botany and what's been going on with the capacity to excavate down and find out what the soils were like at this time, and to see not only the plants that were in those soils, but also there's been a lot done with one of Charles Darwin's favorite critters that he liked. And you have an idea what I'm talking about?
Yes, of course. It's barnacles.
Nope, it wasn't barnacles.
I know he loved
You got
barnacles.
the right letter, right beginning letter.
Yeah, the beetles.
Beetles. Beetles are very prevalent all over the world. Amazing variety in beetles. There's something like 30 or 40,000 different types of beetles, and they all live and thrive in a variety of different climates and types of plant life and so on. So these highly knowledgeable people that study beetles can actually use beetle dating.
Yeah.
They can talk about the climate that people were living in, the types of things that those types of beetles must have been eating, and so they get a very good picture based on knowledge of different types of beetles as to who and what was actually prevalent in this culture, in this climate.
So the famous biologist J.B.S. Haldane is one of his quotable quotes is that if one could conclude anything as to the nature of the Creator from a study of creation, it would appear that God has an inordinate fondness for beetles.
Right,
So-
right, yeah.
There's just a huge number and variety of beetles.
Right, and that was actually one thing that got Charles Darwin excited. He, like I said earlier, he'd travel around and collect beetles, and that was a favorite pursuit of
Yeah.
many. Actually, some of these gentlemen country squires, or actually the ministers of the time that were
Yeah.
landed people that would like to do that. And one pursuit that I think Darwin originally started of is he was trying to prove the wonder of the world and the beauty that God created by looking at how many different kinds of beetles he had. And that's one way to look at it. And then I think he came quickly to an understanding that, well, not quickly, but slowly to an understanding of how important climates and different things were in the creation of not only beetles, but all the creatures on the earth.
Yeah, and eventually dispensed with the notion that they were, created specially, but came up with the idea that all living things are related.
Right, right. So I have kind of a beginning question. I say the Alaska Land Bridge, and it's still used today, they still talk about it today, does the picture on your screen seem to look like a land bridge to you? I know the image that I got when I was young and in school was this narrow thing, almost, similar to the Red Sea parting that Moses did or something. This narrow passageway that people could scrape by, and in between the different areas with the ocean on one side possibly, and the high ends of the glaciers on the other side, and so on. But this doesn't seem to have any kind of evidence of that. There's a nice rolling hill country with
As
a
far as the
river
eye can
running
see.
through. Yes, with some high mountains in the background on there. So it's not in that sense, right? But actually, like I said, this during the last ice age, the last glacial maximum, they call it, when the glaciers were all the way down to Wisconsin and into Illinois, where we are now. We can still see evidences of moraines in this area. So the ice was so built up in that area by a quirk of weather and climate. Actually, most of the land mass that was uncovered because all this water on the planet was taken up by the glaciers actually brought the land forces up in this area, or the water levels down, really, which made much more land there. And the size of Beringia was about twice the size of what Texas is now.
Wow.
So when you think of a land bridge, and most of it was ice-free. Most of it was ice-free. It was this open grassland, steppe land in between Asia's, Russia's steppe lands there, and this the glacier action that came down and was all the way into parts of eastern Alaska, but not through this area. I have some pictures to show it and explain it a
good.
little bit more in a bit.
You went there and took some pictures? Or?
I was there 41 years ago for my honeymoon, and that's the
nice.
last time I was there. My brother lived in Alaska for a while, but it was after the last glacial maximum by a few
Okay,
years.
good to know.
Yeah. So this was the Earth's most extensive biome at this time, all the way from Spain through Eurasia, through Russia, down into China, across Beringia, and into Alaska, what's now known as Alaska. All areas that were this Mammoth Step with highly productive, very fertile grassland. It was an arid, dry kind of steppe. It wasn't sometimes what you see in tundras and stuff now with very spongy and moist and swampy almost. It was very arid and dry. You'd see a lot of dust blowing and things like that.
Taiga, I think, is the wet, marshy.
Taiga can have forests in it, though, I believe, too.
Okay.
So I'm not so sure. So here's another picture of what it may have appeared at the time. See high mountains in the background. That could have been where some of the glaciers were cresting over there, but also a lot of this open, rolling grassland. And here you see it with some trees in it too. We'll talk about that in a bit. Or this, does this what you think about when you think of a land bridge? I kind of like this picture. It kind of shows a young mammoth being defended by an elder mammoth, and the scimitar cats slinking off with disappointment in their eyes. You can,
Yeah, I can see that disappointment from here.
right, and looking for something else. But and the other ones are coming pounding up. The other mammoths are coming pounding up to see if they can be of help too.
A lot of Mammoth Steps there.
Right. So, and what you start seeing more in some of these pictures, again, are trees, a dead tree in the front, and other tree limbs, trees in the background, and so on, which isn't classic. It wasn't in that first picture, but that was as some of the climactic changes occurred, trees became more popular. There's some reasons to think that as the great herds of the megafauna died off, they weren't eating as much of the young shoots, and so then as time went by and as the megafauna and climate changed and the megafauna started dying out, then more trees could come in, which would make it a more habitable place, allowing for fuel, for fires and things like that for the paleo Amerindians that came in at the time. So another picture, and we'll talk about a few of the things that we see in this picture. Again, the classic carnivores by their prey, and a woolly rhinoceros on the right, and some mastodons walking by in the back. So I can't read it too well. I'm going to have to look over at the side here. But for roughly 80% of the last million years, Beringia has connected Russia with Canada. Excuse you.
Yeah.
So we're living in a time that's somewhat atypical, right? We know that the glacial maximums occurred. There was a lot of water tied up in glaciers, like I said, that went through areas less, Antarctica was just massively covered with glaciers. So there was less water, and this whole area up here for 80% of the last million years has been free and open for access to go across from Russia to North American continent. You can't even really distinguish which is part of which continent at some of those times. So that's something to keep in mind that I wasn't so aware of, how prevalent Beringia was around.
There seem to be maybe horses in this picture.
Horses, right?
When you were talking about steppe land, it occurred to me that what you were describing about the characteristics of the steppe land would seem to make a perfect place for horses as well.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And horses were supposedly originally originated in North America, traveled the opposite way over to Russia and China, and then became important animals there too.
And found a good home in the steppe lands of Asia and whatnot.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Good feeding grass and grounds. Very productive, high in caloric content. So again, noting the trees, which it's indicative of unfrozen ground, because trees can't grow when the ground is frozen all year round. And so when it's unfrozen ground, it's showing that the climate has been warming up slightly in this area. This would be later, closer to the time that humans came into Beringia. And it's indicative of the fact that this is going to be a good fuel source for fires by the natives that started to populate into this area. There's a wide array of food sources. The carnivores are looking pretty happy. And
I don't see despair in their eyes this time.
right, there's not as much despair in their eyes. Right? But yeah, wide variety and amazing amounts of this megafauna were there. We can't hardly imagine the amounts, the vast herds of different kinds. When I talk about one of my favorite animals, the antelope, at about this time in North America, there were 14 different species of antelope, and the herds were just enormous. Even Lewis and Clark talked about the herds of antelopes, and it would just be looking like the whole ground was moving and flowing. They were running so fast and so tight together. So all this different variety of animals and a wide array of food sources that the animals found ways to fit into a niche, and the carnivores did as well too. Of those 14 varieties of antelope, 13 became extinct in about the last 12,000 years. And the pronghorns almost became extinct when white men started having them for sport. The weather and temperatures would actually be fairly similar to coastal weather in Alaska today, and that's developed by some of the studies of the beetles and the grasses and the herbs that grew and the different things that they've been able to excavate and find. So again, this is a major change from the vision of what was expressed in the 1950s, that the time frame is changing in all this, and a lot of this makes it worth talking about today. But fairly similar weather patterns. The other thing is that megafauna are generally getting large is a trait that is developed in animals that live in colder climates too. So as large animals do well because they can keep their body heat contained and so on, smaller animals have much more surface area and lose their body heat. And,
By ratio, yeah. Right.
So again, it's a reason for, there were sloths and beavers the sizes of VW buses in those days.
Wow.
It was mostly snow and ice free, while glaciers were present as far south as Wisconsin and Illinois. So we were going through a different type of climate here at that time, but in all of Beringia had basically a lot of free open land. It would have been a much more welcoming climate than what we have here. So this is the map I promised you earlier. This is a map nowadays showing Siberia on the left and Alaska on the right, and up at somewhere 65, 70 degrees north latitude, so by the Arctic Circle, and how it looks now with the whole Bering Strait and the Bering Sea there, islands there, tiny little islands of Pribilofs, and Wrangel Island is where the last known mammoths were. There was a smaller size of mammoth that lived there until only about 3,600 years ago.
Yeah, during the time the pyramids were being built, there were still mammoths in the world.
Right, that's a good way to look at it, yeah. So I'll toggle on, and the map on the right that'll come up has this map underneath it, and the colors are a little bit unfortunate. This color still is there, and then there's a slightly different yellow color to show what Beringia looked like. And you'll have to look and see where Seward Peninsula and the Chukotka Peninsula are, and you'll be able to see the names for them there, and you'll be able to see what Beringia looked like and see this vast size of it. Remember, Alaska's half the size of the continental United States, and this is going to add so much more land to this. So here it is on the left side of your screen. Mm-hmm. And you can see the Seward Peninsula and Chukotka Peninsula still identified in there. The same rivers. It's actually the exact same map with Wrangel Island and the Pribilofs, but all of that was land mass there. You can see how much further north the whole land goes and how much further south this land goes along the length of all the Pribilof Islands, down the length of the arm that comes out of Alaska.
Down to the Aleutian chain.
Down to the Aleutian chain, right. And you can see also very little snow. And the snow is more relative to the high mountain peaks and things in that area at that time. So that to me is phenomenal. It's hard for me to use the term land bridge in my mind and think of this. This is a continent-sized stretch of land. And I think, and then maybe it was just my fault or the teacher's fault of not explaining it well or something, but I imagined something completely different when I thought
Like a
of this
little
area.
50-mile wide path that
Right.
went through the ocean.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So this was a land to live in and had all varieties of different needs to be met in different areas. There were lakes there that had water for people. They had a whole variety of different climates and features to live on and to hunt on and so on. So pretty amazing.
Mike, did you study during your research how scientists have determined, that lakes were there or the course of rivers in this now sort of submerged region? Did you come across anything like that?
Well, obviously, they've been able to explore in certain areas that are still part of the landmass, right?
Mm-hmm,
So they were able to do that now. It's very hard for them to do any kind of exploration when these things are 100 meters
Yeah.
or so, 300 feet below sea level.
They could take core samples to get pollens and.
There were core samples taken by people looking for oil.
Oh, okay.
And they wanted to get
Right.
down actually to the times of dinosaurs, and on the
Sure.
way down, they had the sediments that they had to go through from the
Oh, yeah.
Pleistocene and Holocene.
Right.
So actually, scientists were able to grab those core samples
Okay.
and investigate, and that's where they found the different seeds of different types of plants and the different beetles. And they also found in many areas in varying amounts of mammoth dung.
Yeah.
Very
You go drilling for oil, sometimes you get mammoth dung.
yeah, yeah. And the scientists can be even happier. So, yeah, they found out about what the mammoth were eating, which gave them an idea of what the topography and what the sampling of different plants and animal life was like. And pretty amazing what they've been able to determine. Basically, they proved that there were, in the mammoth dung, they saw that there was much more reliance by the mammoths on herbs. It was the main food source of many of these megafauna rather than the grasses that you'd think they eat.
So parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a song about that. So, I wanted to move into some thoughts about the settlement of the Americas and what happened in there, and what we may have been taught. On the first side was the proposal back in the 50s of the Clovis first theory, and if you know the Clovis, I even have some pictures here, Clovis points, Clovis tools were highly stylized, very specifically made stone points that were often tied to shafts or to make arrows or to make spears. There was developed, I think it's called the atzlatl, which is the throwing atlatl.
Atlatl.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mike L's coming in from
On high.
on high telling
Yeah.
us stuff, yeah. Atlatl, and this was an extension of their arm. It was actually something that had a niche, a nook in it that held the back of their spear, and it was a longer stick, and it would somewhat extend their arm so that they'd get more leverage and throw this thing with much more force. They got pretty close to these animals, so it wasn't a matter of distance. They just needed power to get through their tough hides and so on. So the sharpness of the Clovis tools was a good technology development at the time to allow hunters to gather the food they needed to survive.
Maybe the animals had thick fur and hide too to help insulate from. I assume it was still cold. It wasn't perhaps covered in ice, but it was still cold.
Right,
Yeah.
right, yeah. A cold and arid environment. So the proposal, it sounded and it made so much sense, that this is all covered with snow, which it really wasn't, snow and ice, which it wasn't. But then they had tough hides to protect them, these animals, and the people needed to get the fur to make clothes for themselves and boots for themselves and so on. But, so it all seemed to make sense that they lived there in this manner, but then there's been a lot of development on things on that too. But this Clovis first theory felt like most early settlements, most early things that were found with early humans in North America had Clovis points associated with them. Clovis is from Clovis, New Mexico, where the first Clovis points were found.
We have Michael from online who makes an observation. He said that there's a mystery around the Clovis points, that they do not resemble any stone technology found in Siberia. The closest that we have from across the land bridge is from the Solatrine points from Europe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, pretty
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's always nice when we get some comments and people throwing in some thoughts, because there's definitely, a lot to discover and find out about this. I'm picking
Yep.
through and choosing, but also not an expert in it myself too, so it's nice to get some of these. So these Clovis points were kind of indicators that now humans were much more troublesome to the animals. They were killing them much more efficiently, and humans were growing in population across North America and up north. And so basically there became a theory based on all of this that humans were a big cause of the extinction of much of the megafauna. A megafauna is something that's defined as any large creature that weighs more than 100 pounds, basically, as its standard size.
So we're megafauna.
Yes. 70% of megafauna died off in about 12,000 years, about the time, again, that humans were interacting with them more, and we'll talk more about the feelings, the challenges, and the thoughts about what caused the death of the megafauna in a little bit. But basically, extinction may have been caused by overkill by humans. There's basically four theories. Overkill by humans could have done it. Some climate change possibilities as the climate changes and you saw more trees growing and things like that. Then there was a different food source and food abilities. Large animals don't do as well in warmer climates for the most part. And so it's interesting that they're still around in Africa, right, but not so much in Canada and North America. Disease was another potential theory. And then whenever you're talking about things that happened a long time ago that changed something drastically, somebody always throws in the asteroid or comet impact theory too. So those are the four that tend to be still discussed. So the Clovis theory, the settlement of the Americas, felt like at some point people could not get into America. There was no easy way. People couldn't get across from Europe. People couldn't get across from Africa. The Polynesians ultimately did get there, but it was much, much later in history. And there's the whole technology of boats and means of getting across large, vast bodies of water was a very difficult concept, difficult development, and boats were mainly shore-hugging things that extended fishermen's capabilities to get out, but people tend to stay close to
Within sight.
sight of shore, right? And then there's the stories that are told, some become myths of being blown off course or blown out of the way, and somehow that's how things happened as well too. But typically fishermen and so on weren't planning for a long journey and to start a new life in a whole new place, so they really didn't have, women aboard maybe, and children aboard, and food aboard to stay a while and to do their things. So it was always an easier thing to imagine this, that finally as the glaciers started receding, which we know they did, at some point it was possible to sneak past them and get further on into America. But as they've studied more, they've gotten more of a timeline of a lot of these things, and we'll talk about that as well too. And so the Clovis theory thought that Asian ancestors must have made their way over a narrow land bridge, and that would have been about 12 to 14,000 years before the present, which is a troublesome time, as you'll see in a short while. Actually, if the 12 to 14,000 is about when the glaciers were beginning to melt, actually there was such a long distance and such a challenge to what was being done and how to feed yourself as you traveled over that. As soon as a glacier recedes, you wouldn't call it the most fertile landscape. It would be bare rocks, scraped clean of any kind of growth or living things. And so it would not be a very inviting path for people to travel, to say, I'll walk a few hundred miles along this. And
This barren, rocky landscape.
Right.
Yeah.
So they think that probably the earliest access that people would have had would be about 11,500 years before present.
And do you think maybe, or maybe you've read a definitive answer to this? Was it, coming down from Beringia via boats, just sort of looking for fishing along the shore? Maybe that was some of the first excursions, southward into the Americas?
Right, when you think that so much of this landscape, and maybe I'll go back a few points here, you do see a bit of snow and ice along the bottom there, but it's another potential possibility. There's so much we don't know yet, and the one thing that's really missing from some of the proofs is the fact that any of those coastal areas where they settled in those days would have now be
underwater.
300 feet
Yeah.
underwater.
Right.
Okay. There are things going on in British Columbia, and they're finding some interesting things in there. And I think something is starting to come together there, because in some level, when you're close to glaciers, they put a heavy weight on the land, and the land sinks. And so the land sank for a good amount, but also when the glaciers retreated, the land was able to rise again. So as the water levels rose, the land rose, and they think that there's parts of British Columbia that, again, geology and some of these amazing capabilities of people, professionals in these fields, are able to say that the coastline in parts of British Columbia are within 12 feet of what they were
Wow.
at the height of Beringia as well, too. So things.
Could I, this is really a fascinating topic to me. It reminds me that about this same time, Doggerland, that connected the British Isles to the European mainland, was another sort of land bridge. And there's been some speculation also that the culture that eventually became the Sumerians were a coastal people that lived much further into what's now the Gulf region of the Middle East, as the Levant and the Fertile Crescent and whatnot had a lot more land that's since then been covered by water. So this had implications all over the world, this dramatic climate change.
I know as they're looking in the Mediterranean Sea, they're seeing that campsites are many hundreds of feet. Sometimes, I guess.
In the Black Sea, especially, and in the Mediterranean, before the Pillars of Hercules split and let the Mediterranean fill up.
They were much lower at that time, and the Mediterranean Sea at a much lower elevation. So they're wondering about what's where, what campsites are there.
Yeah, cool.
What they could find. Yeah. So that gives an earliest access going over the land bridge. Which again is what I was taught at about 11,500 years ago. And that doesn't comport, as you'll see, with some other data that comes up. So on the right-hand side of this settlement of the Americas, this is another theory that's come out much more recently, and it's called the Beringian standstill, which sounds like the worst prom dance ever. But first settlers, according to this theory, may have entered Beringia up to 40,000 years before the present from Lena river sites. So Lena is a river in Russia. And so they see, again, with other ways of correlating, and some of this is genomic data, right? You can take the genomes of native Alaskans, Aleuts, and things like that. And there isn't a lot of human remains from this time up in Beringia, but they've been able to see some genomic similarities. And the similarities and differences that they've seen have led them to believe the next statement, that after some of these settlers moved into Beringia about 40,000 years ago, their theory is that there had to be physical separation, as if ice formed or land formed, or just people really had a bad argument and didn't want to go back.
Yeah.
And so there was a physical separation of these two cultures for quite a while.
Huh.
Some are saying 8 to 10,000 years of isolation, so that the genomes didn't continue to be mixed and matched. They were able to isolate, and they've been able to determine about the time based on mutations that take place in the genomes and so on, to see that there's similarities between the Lena River people and some significant differences too. So that was a genomic differentiation of 8 to 10,000 years of isolation.
Genomic archaeology.
Right. Physical anthropology, they call it now in some ways. And then comes along what you were mentioning, Scott, the possible water route along the shore, because still there has to be a way, when you see what's going on in America, that maybe some people came across at the land bridge time, but maybe there were Native Americans here already before that. So
It wasn't just one pulse then, or one populating event. There might have been several.
right, according to this theory, right?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of go over, we've talked about a lot of this new evidence from many fields, and I thought it was worth kind of thinking about each one, or talking about each one. Just archaeology, the fact that people are out there in the field digging up campsites along British Columbian waterways that seem to show water-based people along shorelines, and then they can start extrapolating what they think, how that occurred and when they came there and so on. So there's a lot of archaeology going on, more in British Columbia and more in America than up in the ancient Beringia. Because a lot of what's left of Beringia, like I said, is underwater, and you're not going to, it's not an easy thing for investigation except with core samples. Pleistocene geology, there's so much more known now than in the 50s about what the geology of the land was like. We just felt like water, ice was everywhere, glaciers were everywhere. Now they can tell where the glaciers were and where they weren't. The glaciers that came here in Wisconsin and Illinois took up water that didn't allow glaciers to form in this dry, arid, cold climate up in Beringia. So a lot about Pleistocene geology is added to people's knowledge of this going on. Physical anthropology, which is more the study of how people came to be where they're at, the studies of their physical natures, their ways of investigating the world, and so on. So physical anthropology investigations
The
of
artifacts they leave.
the artifacts they leave, right, and comparing them to other places. Radiocarbon dating has improved quite a bit, and the capacity to really hone in on dates and so on from that. And DNA analysis has just taken off. The capacity to make a whole genome of a creature and evaluate it, and the capacity of what that teaches you about maybe their history and so on.
I wonder if, just occurred to me, I wonder if DNA analysis of some of the other fauna in North America can also support this idea that there was a periodic separation, or an extended separation between the biomes.
Yeah, I'm thinking,
curious
I mean,
about
so
that.
you're imagining that maybe they take the genome
The sheep, pronghorn sheep, or some
pronghorn sheep and compare them
yeah.
to a similar creature from
Yeah.
the other side, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much wealth of knowledge out there, and a capacity for investigating this to try
Yeah.
to understand what's going on.
Makes me want to go and study this now.
Yeah,
And this is one of the things I love about Science Sunday is it whets our appetite to go learn more.
Right, right. Yeah, I tend to feel like we're really touching the surface in some ways, and there's, you get to these people and you see how they can compare and say, but of course, when you look at what happened over here, this has a tremendous implication to the things I've been working on for 20 years or something like that too, and be able to discuss it.
And Michael online again contributes the notion that genetic studies support the idea that there were 3 major migrations of people into the New World. So,
Okay.
I don't know if that was something you were going to mention.
I hadn't heard the 3. That'd be interesting to hear the data that leads to that. And maybe Michael can give us some more of that.
Maybe you can do a Science Sunday follow-up one of these days.
That'd be really nice. Yeah.
Sounds like an area of interest of his.
This, I'm not sure how well it'll show up on your screen. I got this out of Wikipedia, and this is basically giving you a map of the earliest securely dated, mean high confidence, right? Securely dated sites showing human presence in the Americas. 24 to 13,000 years before present in North America, and 22 to 11,000 years before present in South America. Some of these dates, some of these times are highly contested by other scientists, which is what science does. There's a cave in Mexico that has some amazing little tools. They look like stone tools, but they aren't as obvious as the Clovis tools. And they aren't tools from that cave, though. They're not the tools that maybe like little chips fell off the ceiling or something about.
Yeah.
So they have some pretty strong indications that these are introduced into that cave system.
Manufactured somewhere, maybe. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's a great debate about that one way or the other as to what they really are. But you can see that there's some down there. Toca da Tira Pele in South America there, 22,000 years ago in the Amazon area. And there's one bluefish up in Canada, 24,000 years ago. So that doesn't comport with the land bridge crossing idea at all. How do these people get all over and spread over all the way through down to Monteverde at 14,800 years ago when the land bridge wasn't even traversable in scientists' opinion by that time? So that leaves up a large amount of possible explanations. And some there's just not enough data to support. I mean, you can start making up hypotheses of all sorts. You can imagine that a few Polynesians were able to somehow get across the ocean and land there. And they did later on, so it's not that it's impossible. They did later on, but it's
Easter
hard
Island
to...
is pretty close to South America, isn't it?
Easter Island and so on is there, yeah. But it's a very big stretch to say that they had the technology for boats that were able to traverse the seas at that time. But you have to start thinking of all varieties of different possibilities. There's talk about, there's a myth or a story that Romans were blown off course. They know that they got out to the Canary Islands, I believe, off the coast of Africa. But it would be quite a bit more to be a few more thousand miles to be blown off course and to get to South America.
And another 10 or 20,000 years earlier as well.
Right. Right. So anyways, this tends to bring up some of the challenging dates that it's very secure, very known that these dates are accurate to the level that radiocarbon dating can be done, but also, what is the explanation for it? It's very open to philosophies and different thoughts. Then I think Scott showed me this, and it's been in the news. You may have heard about this, but pretty interesting stuff. And I actually, just this morning, I saw more, so I threw in a few more slides in my data here. And you may be wondering, there's a guy in a Park Service uniform digging a trench. He's digging in a trench in White Sands, New Mexico. And you can see it's a sand trench, and he's digging his way through it and looking at things, and this is what they found in this area. Ghost tracks, they call them. They usually show up a little bit better if it's precipitated. If there's been some rain, it shows up. But these are human footsteps. But when are they from? Who knows when they're from?
Well,
Except that they started doing some things
they
to
did.
date
They
it.
do know, right? Yeah.
And the way they dated it was they took sediments that were directly above it and sediments that were directly below it, and they started seeing some interesting things in there. It wasn't just sediments of sand. I think I'm going to skip to, this is some of the most amazing footprints there. Isn't that something?
Didn't they have shoes?
They,
That's interesting that the people, or it was just sandy and they just didn't
I have
wear
a
their
picture
shoes.
of what the environment they think it was like that they were
Okay.
walking in. But these are seeds of a plant that's called a common ditchweed, I believe. And so these seeds were right in the layers above and below these people. And these layers, they weren't just there like this is one day walking around at the beach. These layers that they found these footprints in represent almost 2,000 years of time, too. So this was a people that lived there for quite a while. And when they radiocarbon dated these seeds, they found that these seeds were somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years ago.
Wow.
Just amazing.
Yeah, there's all kinds of things that can be dated. You talked about, beetles and their seeds, and pollen can also be dated, which something Michael pointed out in chat.
So here, I'm not sure, this is an artist's reconstruction of things, and they want to show all that's going on, but they show maybe what this area could have looked like. Water environment, they've got some Bactrian-style camels walking up on the shoreline, and some elephants or creatures of that species there. In the back, there's a large, short-faced bear standing up on its hind legs, looking pretty imposing.
Oh, yeah.
And then people all walking around through it. So unlike the misleading stories that they sometimes tell in flat Earth theories or Bible stories, we never walked the land with the ancient dinosaurs.
Yeah.
But we did walk the land, or people like us walked the land with this megafauna in North America, in New Mexico. And that's just fascinating when you think of it.
Oh, gosh, yeah. So what's with that's just like a cutaway, the artist trying to say it's...
I had a lot of trouble explaining what that really meant, and on the right side it's cut away further.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure. What they're really trying to show, I think that maybe they're trying to show what it looked like in the present on the far side,
Versus,
and then what it looked like here. But it was definitely a watery environment and sandy, and there are a lot of they have different sizes of these footprints, and they think that it's mainly a lot of teenagers, and younger children hanging around and doing stuff, and
Like they do in White Sands today. A lot of young
Yeah.
people go out there to
Yeah.
play around.
And so, and some of that was that maybe teenagers were being tasked to go out and do things, or maybe they just had the chance to go day at the beach or day at different
Yeah.
things. The mind starts wandering as to what the reason is. Were they the people that could go and get the water that the
Right.
group needed, and so they were on tasks that they needed to be done?
Or get shellfish. Maybe they had a particular job to do.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So, but yeah, your mind can start wondering what these people were doing, and it's supposedly this whole scattered pattern. Like it looked like they were running around and pushing each other and having fun or something like that too. So, I know we're coming close to the end here, and I wanted to kind of tie it up with some levels of thoughts about what's clear about this whole concept now that we talked about it so much, and if you look at and try to talk about what we know about this, you're almost more faced by what we still don't know. The more we learn, the more we know, the more we realize there's more questions to ask. And again, that's the beauty and the wonder of science to me too, that there's always more to try to figure out and understand about each part of this. Why was the climate like it was? Why was it so consistent? And a consistent climate is good for cultures and civilizations to develop. And why did these people leave Beringia? Under what scenarios?
Right.
And what causes? And part of it was climate change. Things were changing up there, and the land was significantly altering. And basically, there's some level of feeling that in Beringia, after the ice melted and things like that, there was a significant climate change with warmer weather, and animals were not so suited for that environment. When the animals were not so suited, then the people had less reason to stay there too.
Right.
But then you get into the point where what we've, I think, thought of for a lot of years since the Clovis Theory came out, it was almost like this explanation that humans were these efficient killing machines that were able to kill off the megafauna, and we're to blame for why there's not, mammoths and mastodons walking around today in the area. But that is having some pushback from people too, that it's not possibly that. They found areas that animals seemed to do better at when they were smaller, which again leads to the idea that climate was changing pretty consistently. With the significant changes in climate, it's hard to say that humans were the cause of it all.
Right.
They may have contributed significantly to it, but it could be that they wouldn't be around anyways right now. I kind of felt like we would have had 13 kinds of pronghorns and still the American cheetah and the smilodon and all the saber-toothed tigers and things like that still around if humans hadn't, killed them with their Clovis points. But that's not so true. So there's quite a lot more that we know now, and I hope I tried to bring those ideas to you, the ways to date and time and place these things.
That's also, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk the possibility of a smaller meteorite strike, smaller than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. There's been growing evidence over the past several years that I've seen occasionally in science news articles about growing support for the idea that there was a medium-sized extinction event, specifically in North America, due to meteorite impacts. So the quaternary extinction event. Yeah.
And I'm not sure, this is just a throw-in I'm putting in now, but I know that the Yellowstone super volcano there, that had exploded a few times and caused some amazing kinds of disruption and things like that too.
It's just too complicated, Mike. There's too many pieces to put together.
Yeah, quite a bit. So we know quite a lot, but there's also, we know not much, I'd say, in many ways too. So I think that's maybe the story of science in some of its ways as well too. But to me, it's a fascinating topic. I'd like to look more into some of the animals and what they did and why, how they got here. I think that's fascinating. If Mike, was that Mike that called in with some thoughts?
Yeah, Michael Pollock.
Okay. And others that have some interest in this area and can fill me in on stuff, if you can direct me to some articles, and we'd love to have somebody with the knowledge of it come in and talk about it as well too. So
Michael said he's got an anthropology degree, so might be a good victim. I'm sorry, a good presenter.
And he's willing to still listen to me, man.
Yeah.
Anyways, Mike, if you want to get in contact me or anyone else with other thoughts for Science Sundays, 19Mike55 at Comcast.net. I really appreciate your participation, And the input, I think, helped clarify some of the things that we were saying here, so.
I recently came across a description of science that I really loved, and somebody, I forget who it was, but commented on the fractal nature of science.
Okay.
You know, the fractal nature being, you know, you make progress in one area and it just sort of splits into innumerable other tributaries of investigation, kind of like the path of a river delta or whatnot, you know, fanning out into an infinitude of potential areas of study. So.
Yeah, and when you think of what people make as their topic of study, I think we were talking about this a few weeks ago, that somebody decided to study that tuatara in New Zealand, that little creature you fell in love with when we talked about relics, this creature that's still around and only around because it's protected from the invasive animals that came in and thought its eggs were tasty.
So you said this is going to be the first of several conversations and topics you want to have?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, about the Pleistocene? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah. I was looking into, because I think I misled people about an amniote, the amniotic creatures, that tuatara is an amniote. And an amniote can be an egg-laying creature or an amniotic fluid. It's the fluid that's there to help protect things as the babies as they're being developed. So birds, oops, something's jumping through here. But anyways, so an egg-laying creature is an amniote, like a turtle or things like that, or a bird, and so is a placental type of creature.
What is not?
What would not be an amniote? I would think that...
If birds and reptiles and mammals...
I don't think insects would be, but I'd have to understand exactly why. I'm not sure about, fish seem to have, in their egg sacs, they seem to have something that they feed on for a while too.
The egg white, as it were.
Yeah.
Huh. All right, and then I'll be back in 3 weeks. You talked about the first people of the Americas. I'm going to talk about the first stars.
Right.
So I'll see your people and raise you a star.
Okay, good. Elements. And that's 3 weeks from today. Scott is traveling 2 weeks from today, so Science Sunday will be 3 weeks from today. Thanks so much for coming in, and appreciated it, and I thought it was a fun topic, and hope to hear from Mike and others.
Take care, everyone.